Hi, this lesson is all about landslides, the movement of rock material down a slope under the influence of gravity. Now, there's a few things we need to consider about these. We're going to start by looking at the different types of landslide and then look a little bit at the causes of those. Now, we're going to be looking at pages 23, 24 and 25 of your Theme 8 booklets. There's no writing for this lesson. It's just reading the information and understanding what it tells us. Okay, let's have a look. There are different types of landslides. There are different ways in which rock material can move down a slope. We tend to lump these all together as landslides, or perhaps more correctly, mass movement is the term. But there are some different types, and these will actually pose a different degree of hazard. If we start in the top left, a translational slide, this is, I suppose, your classic rock slide, is where we have solid blocks of rock sliding down a slope. Very dangerous, but relatively uncommon. The top middle there we have creep. Creep is the slow movement of soil material down a slope. This happens gradually over time. You can see on the diagram there, it tilts structures, it pushes things out of line, but it happens very, very slowly. So cumulatively, it can cause some damage to buildings, but it's certainly not a threat to people. Top right then we have rotational slip. This tends to happen in relatively weak rock material where we get an almost circular movement of rock down the slope, and it tends to sort of slump its way off. This is quite dangerous. Certainly is a big hazard to property, can also affect people to some extent. The bottom left then we have what we call a topple. This is where we have almost vertical blocks of rock that sort of fall over. It makes for some spectacular landforms, but isn't a particular issue that we need to worry about in terms of a hazard. A rock fall in the bottom centre is where we have, it's very common on the coast, where we have a rock face that gets undercut. So erosion happens at the bottom of the rock face. Eventually the top of the rock face then isn't supported by rock underneath it anymore, and it falls off. The final type, a flow, is where we have weak rock material that gets lubricated by water. And these can be very dangerous. These happen quickly. They will go around corners. They will fill up valleys, push buildings over, drown people. Flows are really the dangerous ones, mostly because of their speed. Okay, let's have a look at some of the causes of these. I've already hinted at the fact that the type of rock has a big influence on this. How strong that rock is, how cohesive it is. Does it stay together as a solid, or will it break apart into its little grains? As part of that, we need to think about the porosity and permeability of the rock. How water is actually getting into the rock. Water is crucial in understanding how landslides work. Any structures within the rock can provide pathways for that water to get in. If we have cracks or joints or faults or bedding planes or any breaks in the rock can let water in. And finally, we also have to think about how weathered the rock is. For example, granite can be very, very strong. But if it weathers down, if it breaks down, the feldspars in there will break down to clay, and we end up with what can be quite a weak rock. So geologists need to consider all of these factors when they're looking at the likelihood of a landslide occurring. It's not the only feature. There are others. Slope angle, for example, how steep the slope is. Ties back with the idea of rock type. There are some rocks that are stable at only very gentle angles. Clay, for example. Anything much above about 30 degrees, clay will start flowing down the slope. So you can only have gentle slopes with clay. There are some other rocks though that are much more cohesive, much stronger. Granite, for example. The photograph here is taken in Yosemite National Park. The granite there is incredibly hard. So hard we can have overhanging cliffs of granite that are hundreds of meters high. Although that's not to say that they won't fail at some point. For example, a couple of years ago, there was a rockfall there that killed a climber from Cardiff. Crucially, we need to think about water. Water can be the lubricating factor. This can be the thing that really will weaken a slope. The more water that's in the slope, the greater the chance of it failing. It provides lubrication. If it's under pressure, it actually pushes grains of rock apart and it turns into a liquid and it will behave like a liquid. I've put some links in the lesson notes to show what this is like. Particularly, there were a lot of these mud flows in California after some fairly devastating forest fires recently. The fires killed off the vegetation. The roots of that vegetation were holding the slopes together, and when it rained afterwards, those slopes started failing with some fairly devastating results. Watch those videos to see what that's about. There are some things that people do that can increase the risk or increase the chances of a landslide occurring. Digging out the bases of slopes, water from pipes or sewage, or getting into the rock, taking vegetation away, cutting down trees. Deforestation can be a big problem with this. Impermeable surfaces, taking water away from, this is like roofs and roads, taking water away from one place and putting it into the ground in concentration somewhere else. Or it could just be vibrations from human activity. So this is a hazard that can have both natural and human causes. I've given you an example of a fairly devastating landslide that occurred in the Philippines on page 25 of your booklets. It's worth a read. Okay. We can see that there are lots of different factors that have an influence on landslides and when and where they'll occur. A lot of those are geological. It's one of the key jobs that engineering geologists do, is to look at the stability of slopes, look at the chances of landslides occurring. As we'll see next time, this is a hazard that affects us here in Wales. We'll look at it in more detail next lesson.